It's Just Dessert. Written by Idenato. Read by Rashi. There was no utility in jealousy or envy when it came to crests, though Hubert would be lying if he said there was no sting in his heart during reason class with Lysithea. Pound for pound, she just had greater raw power. She would always be the better dark mage, and Hubert could not contest that, no matter how hard he worked in Lady Edelgard's name. This shortcoming would be tolerable, were it not for the professor's insistence on soliciting Lysithea's assistance for monthly missions and reducing Hubert to her adjutant. "Professor, I need to gain experience on these missions, and Lysithea does not share the battlefield," said Hubert through gritted teeth. "She's not your student. I am. Please, I implore you to place me elsewhere." The professor did not seem as perturbed by this imbalance. "Battlefield? We're just clearing bandits," said Byleth, clearly distracted by all the other students they were managing and the sheer number of missions the class was being sent on. Every other weekend, it seems they were dispatched by the church. Byleth was trying to bring the students at the bottom of the class, Bernadette and Linhart, up to speed with the rest of the Black Eagles. Hubert was just in their way at this point. "Go where I've assigned you," said Byleth, making it clear that this was not up for debate. Hubert and Lysithea were sent off on their own to go clear out a thicket of thieves. Hubert followed in silence behind Lysithea, as she downed bandit after bandit. While she blasted off Meyer, Hubert was composing a letter to the professor in his head. If he was forced to adjunct, then he refused to do so for anyone other than Lady Edelgard. He wondered if the professor would bend to that demand. It seemed unlikely. Lysithea panted from her effort as she supported herself against the only tree near them. "Exhausted already?" asked Hubert, not bothering to hide the boredom in his voice. Perhaps, if she'd for once shared any of the mission, she wouldn't be so fatigued. "No," said Lysithea, clearly annoyed by his presence. "I just need to catch my breath, that's all." Hubert sighed and looked in the direction they were heading. The remaining thieves had all the cover and terrain advantages at the moment, and a sniper could easily pick them off if they stayed in this spot for much longer. "Right, and I suppose we'll just have to wait here then, out in the open?" He swept his arms around to demonstrate how absurdly exposed they were here. Lysithea was looking pale as she glared at him, beads of sweat forming on her brow. She looked about to insult him back when her eyelids fluttered and she stumbled. Her body went limp as she face-planted into the dirt. Hubert's first instinct was to scoff at the pathetic and dramatic display. His contempt faded as he realized she had actually fainted. "Lysithea, get up," said Hubert, as he worked to roll her over. He was met with a soft groan of pain. Hubert looked at their position and the nearest spot with coverage. It was fortunate Lysithea was small. He managed to get her under one arm, to leave his other hand free to cast if needed. The cluster of bushes he chose had a measly 2 bandits within. Hubert took out the first one in one hit. The second was a bit trickier, but Hubert took a painful hit on his shoulder from a club before he was able to fall the adversary. Hubert's ego was not so fragile that he needed an audience when he succeeded in killing a few bandits, but it would have been nice if Lysithea was forced to acknowledge his capabilities for once. Still, she was unconscious, and Hubert was going from agitated to almost concerned. He was not eager to hear what the professor or his classmates would say if they thought he hadn't properly given Lysithea cover in the field out of spite. He could practically hear Ferdinand chastising him for failing to protect a little girl, and Hubert refused to give von Eyre such satisfaction. Hubert's jaw was clenching in pain as he took off his glove to get a read on Lysithea's pulse. Hubert had been given only spirit dust, and no vulneraries on this mission. He wafted the powder beside her nose and watched as her eyes barely opened. "Front pocket of my jacket," said Lysithea, clearly working hard to speak, She didn't seem able to finish her thought. "I hope it's a concoction," said Hubert in a dry voice, as he undid the buttons of her placket. He was meant with a sizable confection instead. "Is this a joke?" asked Hubert in disbelief. Lysithea was too busy forcing the sweet stack into her mouth to respond. Luckily, she did have 2 vulneraries in the pocket as well. Hubert did not ask permission before helping himself to one. The searing pain in his shoulder began to subside as the healing potion took effect. By now, Lysithea was looking slightly less ashen and much more alert. "I get faint sometimes," said Lysithea, as she took the remaining vulnerary. "The sugar helps." "I would have appreciated knowing that before we were assigned together in battle," said Hubert, as he massaged his shoulder. It was one thing for her to knowingly endanger herself, but to put the other at risk, too, was unacceptable. "Does the professor know?" Lysithea shook her head. "I usually manage it well enough," said Lysithea. "What, by stealing biscuits from the dining hall at meal times?" asked Hubert. "So, I may stockpile desserts. What's it to you?" Lysithea asked, as if keeping cookies on her person at all times was normal enough. "I can take care of myself." Hubert said nothing, as he pointed to the 2 bandits he'd killed. Lysithea shrugged and got herself standing. "I suppose that's proof you're not totally useless," said Lysithea, as she buttoned her jacket back up. "Could have fooled me." "Impudent brat," Hubert said under his breath, as he followed her from the thicket and back towards the open. "Lumbering goon," spat Lysithea back. She had her arms folded up and frown on her face that could match his own. "I did not ask the professor to make you my adjunct. Trust me, I would rather work alone than with you." This mutual feeling did not deter the professor from assigning them together for the next 3 encounters. Following missions, Byleth always insisted everyone who participated enjoy a big meal together to foster camaraderie. Hubert picked at his stew with displeasure, while listening to Caspar recount his kills blow by blow. Hubert hated most of the food here at Garreg Mach. No matter the student or their preferences, their trays were always laden with a cup of tea, an oversized portion of some off-putting meal, and a serving of a too-sweet dessert. Hubert generally returned his trays almost full back to the kitchens every night. Tonight would be no exception. Down at the other end of the table, Byleth was sitting with Lysithea and Edelgard. To Hubert's immense annoyance, Edelgard was quite fascinated by Lysithea, and often sought out the girl's company. Byleth could be overheard enthusiastically inviting Lysithea to the Black Eagle's next mission as well. There was even the suggestion that she might teach Hubert some more dark magic if she had the time. It took great effort not to march over to the professor and publicly protest. Threats did not work on the professor. Insults were not working on Lysithea. He needed a new strategy, and he needed it soon. For now, he needed to get out of this dining hall before his tongue landed him in any trouble. Hubert paused as he looked down at his dining tray and the dessert he had not touched. He could attempt a peace offering. The gesture might be so unsettling coming from him that Lysithea would insist they not be paired together. When he passed by Lysithea on his way back to the bussing area, he wordlessly placed the small plate with saggart and cream upon her tray. Lysithea looked up at him in confusion at the act. Hubert shrugged, rather than respond, as he went on his way. He'd let her come up with her own explanation, figuring it would likely be far worse than the truth. Sharing his dessert became a daily routine, even when Lysithea was not asked to help with the Black Eagle's missions. Dorothea was the first to make a comment on this new pattern of behavior. "You must have a thing for girls with white hair," said Dorothea, as she watched Hubert clearing his leftovers into the scrap pile. "Don't you think she's a bit young for you, though?" "She likes dessert. I do not. There's nothing more to it," said Hubert, refusing to give any room for her insinuations of wrongdoing. Hubert did many unsavory things, but this was downright innocent in comparison. He was simply trying to reduce the amount of food waste he left behind each night. Lysithea reaped the rewards, and he did not have to deal with her fainting out on missions. Besides, it was improving their interactions, both in the field and the classroom. He had no motivation to stop. "I like dessert too. So, why haven't you offered me any?" asked Dorothea, her stare narrow and accusatory. He tolerated Dorothea's teasing about his intentions toward Edelgard because she was so wildly off base. He wasn't in love with Edelgard. He was bound to her by years of service and a conscious decision to do whatever it took to put her in power. This accusation regarding Lysithea, however, was striking a different nerve in him. He found he did not wish for Dorothea to even suggest that he and Lysithea were friends, let alone anything more. He had a threatening image to maintain, and he needed to get her to stop before she started spreading any damaging gossip. Hubert's lip curled as a distasteful insult rolled into his mind. My sincerest apologies. My sincerest apologies. I thought I overheard you complaining that your uniform was feeling too tight, said Hubert, as he eyed her waistline. I do not wish to tempt you. You're so rude, said Dorothea in a low grumble, as she slammed what was left of her cutlery down and stormed off. It seemed to do the trick, though, and Dorothea ceased commenting on his sweet sharing. This went on for months and months. Hubert shared his desserts, and Lysithea shared kills on the battlefield. Sometimes they shared a table at the library late into the night, as they tried to outdo each other in the number of spells they knew. Hubert was growing almost fond of being assigned as Lysithea's adjunct, now that they had found this agreeable arrangement. If he was feeling generous, he might even privately call her his friend. Yet the illusion of school was drawing to a close, and soon war would be upon them. Hubert looked at the last dessert he would get from Garreg Mach. A trio of sweet buns was certainly not his favourite food, but he knew for a fact Lysithea loved them. He usually dropped the plate and left, but tonight he sat across from Lysithea, who was reading a book alone instead of dining with friends. I must go home, to Enbar, said Hubert. So, I fear this is your last second helping of sweets from me. Lysithea looked up from her tome in confusion. You're leaving just shy of graduation? Why? I have duties that cannot wait for the academic schedule, said Hubert. He knit his fingers together and contemplated the things he and Edelgard had been discussing of late. This was their critical window for securing allies ahead of the storm. Edelgard was shouldering much of that burden, since she was the better liked of the two, but Hubert had offered to try and secure Lysithea's involvement with their rebellion. Here, said Hubert, as he passed a wrapped parcel across the table. I will not be here for your birthday, but I got you a gift, said Hubert. Lysithea's eyes flashed with a mix of pleasure and suspicion. I did not take you for the gift-giving type. May I open it now? Please, it's just a small gift, really, said Hubert, as he watched her fingers undoing the ribbon. He stopped himself short of claiming it was nothing special, because in his eyes it was meant to be significant, even if she might not see it that way. He did not often give gifts, but he had spent a great deal of time selecting something for her. You were mentioning your desire to emulate Hilda, and, while you already know my misgivings about her, I found a perfume I thought suited you. Lysithea stared at the fine little glass bottle, and then at him. Thank you. This is most unexpected, said Lysithea. It has a hint of peach essence, since you like the sorbet so much, said Hubert, having studied her preferences now for months. Lysithea added a dab of scent to her pale wrist and rubbed them together. A bloom of aroma surrounded them, as if they were walking through a ripe orchard. It's lovely, said Lysithea. Hubert stalled. He'd given over the dessert, and now the gift, and there was just one last thing to ask. I was wondering if you might like to visit Enbar with me, said Hubert, finding his throat dry as he asked. On the surface, he was asking because she was a worthy asset for the war. Deeper down, though, he worried there was a shade of truth to Dorothea's accusations. He liked the feeling of working with Lysithea, of protecting her, and he wanted to keep her close and safe through the war.
A trip? Now? With you?
Asked Lysithea in confusion. A young, noble girl leaving school on an unsanctioned and unchaperoned trip with a man carried a myriad of implications. If people had unfavorable comments about him sharing his unwanted desserts, then they would certainly riot if he shared a carriage with her. Truth mattered little in the face of silent assumptions. "I know you are capable of taking care of yourself," said Hubert in a low voice. He knew the extent of her sickness by now. He knew she was just getting worse. She had suffered in a way he was uniquely familiar with. "But, if you would allow me, I would like to help." His offer hung in the air, unanswered. Lysithea placed the stopper back into the perfume bottle and placed the gift beside her tome. She looked at the sweet buns he'd given her, and then back at him, and shook her head no.
"I'm not entirely sure what you are offering, but I'm afraid I must decline," said Lysithea. "After graduation, I will be returning to my family, and I have no intentions of leaving our lands for Anbar or anywhere else."
"Of course," said Hubert, accepting that if they met again, it would be as enemies. They had shared a pleasant partnership out on the battlefield, but Hubert was accustomed to being alone. "Enjoy the gift. I must be off."
"Hubert, wait!"
said Lysithea, to stop him from walking away. Hubert turned with caution, uncertain of what she might say.
"I might not come to Anbar, but perhaps in the future, if you were ever traveling through the Alliance, you might plan a stop at the Ordelia lands. You would be a welcomed guest."
Hubert found his lips drawing a thin line as he imagined war ripping up her homeland. He declined to speak his heart, that he hoped he would never have reason to go to her lands, and instead gave her a polite tip of his head. "I will keep your offer in mind," promised Hubert, with no intention of ever taking her up on it. It would be 5 years until Hubert saw Lysithea up close again. Emperor Edelgard was in a merciful mood following the successful capture of Deirdre. Claude and Hilda accepted the conditions of their pardon and departed for Elmira. Lysithea did not join them, and instead took a position in the strike force. Lysithea sat down across from Hubert in the feast hall of the captured capital's parliamentary building.
"Are you sharing your sweets with someone else these days?"
asked Lysithea, as she looked at his half-finished plate of daphne stew, a local specialty that made him want to abstain from dinner entirely. There was no serving of saggart and cream to be seen upon the tray, and he had coffee tonight, instead of tea in preparation for a long night of work ahead. Hubert shook his head. "None of the strike force is in need of any extra dessert, in my estimation," said Hubert, as he took in the changes to her appearance. She was taller now, her cheeks a little leaner, and her style much more mature. He'd watched her during the battle, and knew she'd only gotten more powerful in the intervening years. He wondered if the professor was going to force him to adjunct for her again. Or perhaps the tables might be turned, and she would have to adjunct for him instead. He supposed it might not matter, for they had gotten good at taking their equal share of work out on the battlefield. There was the faintest hint of peach perfume on her.
"Well, if you were looking to go up and reconsider getting your dessert to give me, I would not protest,"
said Lysithea, as she watched him. "Are you asking for my assistance in obtaining extra confections?" asked Hubert in amusement, as he studied her in turn. "You're an adult. You can probably just help yourself to 2 servings. I doubt the quartermaster would challenge a deadly dark mage over a little extra saggart and cream."
"I am simply saying, if you still wanted to take care of me in this small way, that'd be fine,"
said Lysithea, as she pushed her own meal around with a spoon. Her eyes traced up to meet his.
"Who knows? Maybe someday we can visit Anbar together. I've heard the pastry chefs in your city are unparalleled.
Hubert swallowed at the unexpected suggestion. Well, now that you're fighting for us, I would hate to see you collapse on the field, said Hubert, as he got up from his chair. He found he did care what others might say, because it was, after all, just dessert.